everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. History is often something we take for granted. There are physical artifacts that have survived throughout time telling the story of the past, and these artifacts are subjected to a rigorous methodological study which confirms their veracity. Simple, right? Well, in many cases, this is true, which is why we believe we have an accurate picture of the past. There are some things which make this process difficult, including our own histories as people and cultures, as well as our interpretation of the aforementioned artifacts and how we decide what gets the rubber stamp of approval. All right, so historicity, which I didn't mention in the monologue. Historicity is what we're talking about today. Yes. And this is something I got interested in. I get sucked down like these Wikipedia rabbit holes, right? I'll read something, I'll get all the way to the end of the article, say, see also, right? Okay, start click. Yep. And then some of the times you read something like, no, this is too fantastical. I gotta go look this up in like an actual professional resource. And then you find out, no, it is true. Like, wow, that's really cool.
Well, yeah, because just a side note, because I've said this so often as a teacher, the people who trash Wikipedia are generally the people who don't pay much attention to it. Wikipedia, you have to teach yourself to look at the sourcing. And if you're provided with the background of the people who actually are putting the material in and the footnotes and so on, then that's pretty good. The further you get into UFO theories and who shot John F. Kennedy, the worse it's going to be, and it's not very, very tangible. So yeah, it's a good rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah. And they're pretty good about putting that up. You'll see if something's said, and you see like the blue question mark after it or the blue citation, you'll know that, okay, well, somebody just said something here and they didn't actually put anything down to back it up. Doesn't mean it's not true, but it means that they didn't right. In college, right? They didn't show their work. They didn't show their sourcing. So, yeah. Anyways, so I'm looking through Wikipedia and I came across the entry on the Library of Alexandria, right? Start reading about the whole history of it and all of the guys who put it together and things. And the part of it that I love, that's really interesting to me when you start looking at ancient history, is the level of detail, especially in, like the Greco-Roman world, where the level of detail that you have about people's lives who lived 2,000 years ago, right? And then the strange things that are known and unknown, right? You have a lot of detail about this certain scholar or philosopher's life, but you don't know exactly when he was born. And sometimes it's not even a range. Like they'll provide two dates like, oh, well, he was either born in 56 BC or 48 BC. Yeah. Well, those are 8 years apart. And they're not saying there's a span. It's just one or the other, right, based off of texts that exist from the time period. And so that's where, I know that a lot of listeners might be coming into the episode thinking, historicity, is that even a real word?
Yes, indeed. Historicity, the authenticity, the seeking of the authenticity of.
Right. So,
the history.
Yeah. So anecdotally, a good introduction into what historicity is that very concept of trying to parse out factual information about historical characters. Another good one that comes from another Wikipedia rabbit hole for me was Robin Hood. I love the stories of Robin Hood. I've read through. I like reading through the oldest source material that I can for it. The older the English and the older the stories, the more interesting it is to me. But there's historians that out there that try to determine if Robin Hood was a real person. Mm-hmm. And there's, they scour the records and they found, well, there's 23 men that existed during the correct time period with the name Robin Hood. And then based off the records, they try to determine, well, were any of these men criminals? Well, did any of these men live in Nottingham? Did any of these things? And they narrow it down. They say, well, you have a couple candidates, right, for a real Robin Hood. Now, certainly, many of the stories are exaggerated or completely invented or whatever. Mm-hmm. But at some point, is there a kernel of truth to Robin Hood being a real person? And that's really the core of what historicity is.
It is. Being, we talked before the show, being married to a person I consider a brilliant historian, but whose choices and opportunities went a different direction. My wife, she's still an avid, omnivorous reader, and we talked this very morning about historicity and the act of history and it's such a tangle that the marvelous thing about history is there are things that one can establish, a document that exists and a constitution or whatever. But there are many, but the moment that something is established, a text is found or discussed, then you're automatically, when you have human beings involved, looking at it through many interpretive lenses. And to try to untangle the interpretive lens from a document or an artifact is enormously complicated, very, very human, and a lifelong work. And so historicity is not a stagnant, static thing as it may sound. It's a process.
Yeah, and definitely. It's funny because there's sort of a science to history. There's a lot of things that have to go into, establishing what sort of events and people actually existed. And, you can think that that's something that would be very hard to do in a level of detail, right? Because I can say that I did something this morning, but nobody can
verify that.
Ever prove it.
Yeah.
And so outside of very specific circumstances like, Pompeii, we don't have detailed historical accuracy on the little minutia of ancient history. But we do have big documents, big artifacts, and events so that we have some sort of a record of what happened.
Right.
But like you said, who is writing the records, right? Or, if you see this type of stone in this layer of strata and this sort of thing, what sort of prior knowledge are you using to decide what kind of building this was or what civilization? That was another one, right? Up until recently, many historians thought the Hittites were just a fabled society, right? And then I don't know how long ago it was. I want to say maybe 20 or 30 years. They discovered, no, the Hittites actually were a real Middle Eastern people, that was distinct from other ones. I'm not exactly sure what sort of information they used to determine that. But the Hittites are another one. They had their own library, extensive record of documents from that time period.
Well, this is right. It's an ongoing thing, and this is something this brings us into our current moment and back out of it again, in the sense of you rely on the authority of trained and educated historians who are going to have a variety of lenses and views, but yet who have the tools intellectually to adequately work with other fields, from archaeology to sociology and so on, to try to tease out the story, if not the meaning, but the story of a building, an artifact, or whatever. So, and amazing things happen. I remember a number of years ago, it wasn't all that long ago, but still, that in Nova Scotia there was a dig that revealed essentially not a city, but a town, so to speak, a community that was about 8,000 or 10,000 years older than it should have by previous standards, right? So you find out something new, and that's where you engage in the very humble. I mean, historians who seriously practice, I think, are like humanities people, literature people. There is a necessary humility you arrive at when you realize how much you don't know because of everything that you find. And that's where the philosophy is. How do you approach some history? Some history might be considered of necessity by someone. What's the moral? What are we to learn from this? Well, that's not the first step. And there may not ever be this one thing we are to learn from something. So, but we're in a time when authority of all kinds is under attack. The authority of knowledge gathering and knowledge interpretation is eschewed. And so when everyone thinks that they can do everything equally well, the likelihood is you're going to have a much more muddled approach to history as well as most other things.
Yeah. Yeah. And, taking the Nova Scotia thing as an example, right? You have a couple options when something like that happens, right? As a professional, you could say, well, the Alaska-Russia land bridge didn't exist at that point. So there's no way people could have been here at that time. Or you could say, well, people must have found a different way. They must have crossed an ocean to get here. Or, maybe the way that we're dating things isn't correct. Or there's a number of different things that play into trying to determine how this thing is possible, or where things are happening. And it really creates it's a very complex thing that happens, and that's why I said in the monologue, like, we kind of take history for granted, right? You read a history book and you think, okay, well, that's what happened. But historicity plays into, there's two definitions. There's the typical one, which is what we've been talking about so far, which is just trying to determine if people and events actually existed. And there's a philosophical sort of definition of it, which talks about people, professionals in the field, professional historians and stuff. They have their own histories, and they live in the context of their own cultures.
Yes.
And the way that they interpret information about the past is necessarily tinted because of their existing experiences.
Yes, and when they're aware of that and they bring that to bear, at least that becomes a revealed, it's made transparent, and it would seem rather obvious anyway, but the result of that is that humility I mentioned before, that if you realize you don't know what you don't know, right? But when you come to know things, to what degree epistemologically do you know them, or to what degree are they being intuited or guessed at, or this is a fragment, this is a piece, we're putting a piece together. Sorry, you can't have the whole picture yet because there's never going to be a whole picture, but maybe there's not enough yet to do what one wants to with the evidence that's given. This is what I think. This is where the difficulty comes when in any culture, but I'll take ours as an example. There are fine teachers of history, but there are also people who are caved to or feel the necessity to the making of ideology, the making of a national ideology, so that history sort of takes a side role, and on stage is, this is what you're supposed to think about us. The history is simple. Here's the things that happened here, the most important things that happened, and thus this is the people that we are. Amen. And first, that's not terribly interesting. Second, it's not terribly accurate. And if you're inviting young people into, or wanting to truly invite young people into a field of knowledge, whether it is philosophy or history or literature and the mush that all of those become because they influence each other, then of necessity you need to reveal, put out in front of people the conflicts of ideologies, the difficulties of interpretation, the lenses that people are looking through. And that's a slower process.
Yeah, but it's a vitally important one, right? Because, I mean, if taking history for granted, you end up with people who believe that the Holocaust didn't happen, right? That 6 million people vanished off the face of the earth, and there's people that don't believe it happened, right?
Right. Choose not to believe that it happened.
Right. So
a counter to the evidence.
And it just goes to show you, like, how little us as lay people know about prior events, right? So at some point, you have to put your trust in somebody telling you what existed, because many of us don't have access to these source documents, right? So that's why historicity is a cool topic, and why it's interesting to dig into how experts and people who have the ability to examine these things interpret them. So I think that we've laid a really good intro to what it is. Why don't we separate it out? What's the difference between history or historicity or historicism or historiography? We'll take them one at a time. So there's history, right?
And so history is basically, no, not basically. Scratch that. I don't like that word. The record, or the implied record, or the encounter with records, texts, artifacts, the study of past occurrences, events, situations, using what evidentiary material that we have.
And that's important, right? Because I think a lot of people think of history as something that happened in the past.
Right.
But that's not true. History is the professional study of the past.
Yeah.
And so probably the easiest way to conceptualize it is thinking about prehistory, right? Like what is prehistory? Well, what it means is it's an era of time where we don't have records or any sort of thing to solidify what happened from a human viewpoint, looking at artifacts or records, that sort of thing.
Right.
It doesn't mean that nothing happened there.
No.
Obviously, back there was a primordial world, there was a universe, but that's the thing that's sort of interesting about that, right? Is that, a primordial world of the universe, we have information about them. We have scientific information about them, but we don't have historical information.
Right. Exactly so. And sometimes scientific information can become historical information if enough pieces are there to find it. And thus, whatever prehistory is, there's not like this border. We always say the Mesozoic era and the Jurassic period and it's like, wow, did we just walk through the door from one period to the next? No, well, maybe across thousands of years or a million years, maybe more or less. It's a pretty expansive border.
Right.
So the more things are found, or that our tools get better scientifically to study it in order to find artifacts that then can be rendered as history. Yeah, there's a relationship.
Okay, so we got history, which is the human examination of the records of the past. And then we have historicity, which is sort of the veracity of the people and events that existed in the historical records. Okay. Historicism.
This is, I'm going to say theory. And now we live in a time, of course, when people say, oh, it's just a theory. No. Theories are well worked out structures that are developed to explain something that is found. So something isn't just a theory. If you say that, you're already off base. It doesn't mean it's absolutely right. It means that it's much more than a guess or even a hypothesis. Sorry. So social, cultural, human interactions that take place are what historicism talks about. Here's the tendency to regard historical development as the most basic aspect of human existence. The theory that social and cultural phenomena are determined by history. Historicism suggests, and I'm saying this as my wife's the trained and licensed historian. I might have other fields, but we all meet in this area of the humanities. And so when you say the theory that social and cultural phenomena are determined by history, history is this active element that affects people. So, in other words, it becomes this cause, which is so it's almost an entity.
Right. Yeah. And that's really fascinating, right? Because no doubt, really, that history is kind of a two-way street. You're on some spectrum, right? No, there's no doubt that history does affect how people's presence and past in certain cultures and in certain contexts and things.
Yep.
But there's also very little doubt that people in certain contexts and cultures manipulate or interpret their history differently, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's definitely a two-way street with this, but historicism, like you said, there's a cause, right? There's this thing that says,
we say this is this place, this is this geographical zone, this is this time period where that's this artificialization of so to a layperson, a time period. Well, then you start seeing the silos or the the columns on the graph, and that's all very nice. But if only things were just that precise, right? But
right.
But it ascribes elements of it foundationalizes, I think, things that might seem arbitrary space-time elements.
Yeah.
This moment,
right?
Ta-da! And all.
Yeah.
And
yeah. So I'm trying to think of a good example of that, and probably a good example would be like the founding of America, right? I mean, if you think about it,
yeah.
And how Americans would view that versus other parts of the world. And then, is something about that history, has that predetermined how the progression of America's present and future based off of what we believe about the history.
Right. And this is a good example because, and you brought it up, it's not my fault. The notion that the country began at a certain moment, almost to the point of religiosity and myth, is a historicism that spins even into wilder zones, as far as I'm concerned. So we know, for instance, and we've talked about this before, but there are those who absolutely are frightened by the notion that is not a notion, that is a documental, that historicity has made clear, of a ship called the White Lion, which brought the first documented slaves in 1619 to this place. Now, this place itself, to say this place, there's trouble with that semantically too, but right, but which then becomes an anchor, a defensible, arguable anchor for this is the beginning of America. Because less than a year later, the Mayflower comes along, and there's our historicism at work. This is the story. Now, pay no attention to that one. This is the story. No, it's all the story.
Yeah, and that's where it gets pretty interesting, right? Is somebody could have both accurate and inaccurate historicity, and I think that's a pretty prevalent phenomenon with founding fathers, right? The example that Wikipedia uses is George Washington, right? So historicity of George Washington's existence is irrefutable. George Washington definitely existed, right?
He was definitely authentic. He exists.
But the historicity of the story of George Washington cutting down a cherry tree and admitting to it.
It's been totally debunked. It didn't happen.
Right. So if it didn't happen, right, But if it didn't happen, but Americans, the majority of Americans live under the notion that it did happen, and then they infer things about their nation because it happened. And then that sort of alters the course of the country based off of people's patriotism. That's kind of historicism, right? That would be sort of what they're trying to say is...
I would say so, yes.
So real interesting concept.
Well, and then even take the phrase fathers of the country. And there will be people listening to this who get all upset. And well, you're supposed to education. I'm just full of things today. Education is under a lot of attack now. Education is one of the primary purposes of education has been for a long time that you have to understand that you're going to encounter information that will make you uncomfortable, that ought to make you uncomfortable, because being uncomfortable means you're starting to rethink things. Doesn't mean you throw away everything. It means that you need to rethink in light of fresh information. When you have a system that gets pressured and pressured and pressured to, don't make me uncomfortable, just tell me the same old things, and it just that way we can just take it in and it'll all be fine. That's sleep.
Yeah.
That's dozing. And so that's philosophically, to me, one of the reasons this conversation is exciting and interesting and important. So, fathers of country, what does that imply? That men are more important. What does that imply? Well, countries are families, except that and so you just take on that word, that phrase. And that allows you to examine the historicism and the biases that are built into the ideology.
Yeah. Yeah. And it really highlights the complexity of humanity and how we try to simplify things, right? It was like we were talking about when we did last week's episode on the Sokovia Accords, right? We have that opening scene
the Avengers and all,
with War Machine and the Falcon, right? We talk about, there's this sort of, people are sort of compelled to put these two guys in the same group, right? Because they're both men, they're both African American, they're both military. And so a lot of Americans, just right off the bat, that creates a stereotype for you, and you think you can infer things about these people because of it. But their backgrounds are wildly different. And that goes not just for individuals, but also for whole groups of people. And the story of American history that we've been told really glosses over those sorts of things, right? And, so the founding fathers, we'll gloss over their issues. And we'll gloss over the fact that there were women that played a big course in history. And we'll gloss over the fact that African Americans built the country, essentially, and all of these different types of things, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why it's such an interesting topic.
History will make you uncomfortable, and it'll make you itchy, and generally, it's for people who love to study it, if they really take it seriously, they would say that. Most people would say that.
Which kind of leads us into historiography. Right? So can you give us a definition of historiography?
The historiography is the study of the writing of history. It's literally the studying of text and the study of how one approaches history through writing. It is, I am told, the most onerous class in a graduate program one can take, because you will be methodically, painfully working through the idea of what writing is about. And it is where one of my fields encounters. There just aren't borders between these things, right? What do we do what is the act of writing about, and where does it come from, and what is the process? And when we revise, what are we actually doing? And then you take that all and you bundle it up with, what am I trying to do with writing in 1492, thus and such happened? What is my intent? Am I trying to skew something? Am I trying to represent it? Am I doing both? Have I revealed that I realize that I'm doing both? And all of that's built into one sentence.
Yeah. It's almost kind of like meta history, right? You're sort of, it's like thinking about
how things are rendered.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's funny because, it's not like it's just some, something that professionals get hooked up on. There's religious people are serious about this. Judaism, right? There's still people over there that, Torahs that people teach out of can only be copied by certain scribes who have gone through certain rituals, who are exactly copying down, what's happened. That's the way it's been forever. That's an obsession with historiography, right? Because, you're saying that everything has to be done from this certain perspective.
It's overlaying a ritual, if of religiosity, or a ritualization that attempts to.
Now that's starting from a fixed point rather than an open point.
Yes.
So rather than saying, what's my intent or what's going on, it's saying, this is the intent. This is the way. This is the way it has been. That's what we're trying to preserve. So it's historiography from
us. No, but it's historiography from the viewpoint of the cultural imperative. Whatever element of the culture is controlling the writing.
Yeah. So it's interesting because that's where, thinking about, like you said, if this is written, if somebody wrote this, what was their intent and what were they thinking? And if I'm writing about it, what is my intent and what's my thinking? And it's really an examination of the objective and the subjective in the record. So do you think a person or event with both accurate and inaccurate historicity constitutes a myth? Robin Hood is our example, right? So if you have Robin Hood, let's say that we can establish there was a Robin Hood. He was a criminal, and he was sort of a folk hero, right?
Right, and a folkloricism, a folkloric, legendary emerges out of that. Because we've talked about this before too. We are creatures of story weaving. We love to weave stories about our normal, mundane little days, about our life circumstances, about the bigger things, levels and levels. So folkloric writing and orality, storytelling of all kinds, music and such, can emerge out of a figure who could be established. We still haven't necessarily established King Arthur, and that's you're Robin Hood guy, I'm a King Arthur guy, right? And evidence seems to point toward a Roman chieftain, a general who absence the Roman Empire gets naturalized into the culture, and a mound warrior have a little hill with a little trench and tries to keep the other barbarians out, even though, well, we all kinds of bits and pieces, and much history has been written, but also knowing that it's not absolute, because so many things have developed in the life of that character and the way that it's represented. And so I don't think that. So what your question was?
Well, I'm sitting here listening to you. I'm already I feel like another series percolating. I'm thinking man, you know what? We should do one on what a legend is, what a myth is, folklore.
Absolutely, because
what all these different words mean. But
right.
My question was, if a person or event has both accurate and inaccurate historicity, does that constitute something, a myth or a legend?
It can give birth to it. I think it's a soup that can give birth to it. I don't think it's of necessity that it will, because we don't have legends about every thief in the history of the world. But I think that it like the primordial soup, when the lightning bolt hits it and life starts. All right, that kind of thing. If the right lightning bolt hits at the right time when the soup is cooking, then the likelihood is stories will be told if it's compelling enough.
Okay. How did Heidegger delineate between historical thinking and historicity? you want to get into Heidegger a little bit and sort of his views on this?
You start. Let's. I've got things I want to say, but you go with what you are thinking.
So I haven't looked into it a whole lot, but I know Heidegger. He sort of railed against historical thinking in preference for historicity. With historical thinking, it's sort of mirroring historicity to some extent, right? He was saying, if you're looking at the past from this kind of fixed viewpoint, and you're thinking about it in a certain way, it leads to completely different conclusions about what the evidence is saying versus kind of approaching things from an objective viewpoint and then letting them speak for themselves. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think, I can't remember if we talked about it on the air or if it was when we were off the air, but I went down to Virginia a few weeks ago and visited a house Thomas Jefferson built in a poplar forest. And they had an exhibit. There was a slave house there, right? And the little placards that they had on different points and whatnot, it used very just objective language, right? It didn't introduce any sort of moral judgments into what it was saying, but it just said, this is where the slaves lived. This is the kind of lives that they lived. This is the sort of thing that this is what happened, essentially. And let you draw your own conclusions, which most reasonable people would draw the conclusion that this was an awful way to live. But, there's things in there, right? Okay. His chief slave followed him everywhere. He lived with his family. They did all this stuff, So there's levels within that too, right? There's how some of them might have been treated, or the life they might have had, or what their perspective was on their life would vary wildly from person to person.
And you've already identified this. And the danger would be to say, and so things were all fine. But no, because ultimately they were still chattel. Ultimately they could still be killed at a moment's notice, sold away, whatever. No matter how momentarily, domestically peaceful at a moment it might have been.
Right. And I think that the important part to highlight there is the power dynamic, right? That's the important part, because if we put it in the context of just your job, right? Let's say that I have a boss, right? And I work with him. I can get along with my boss personally fine, but my work could still have a huge deleterious impact on my health, on, everything else. And then one day I could make a big mistake at work and I'm done, right? Mm-hmm. So the same thing could exist there. I'm sure you could go back to that period of time and ask people, hey, do you like your life? Oh yeah, it's good. Maybe it's good in that moment and it's not good in another moment. But what it doesn't identify is that power dynamic
that has been established.
Yeah, and the morality of that power dynamic, right? We have certain protections as workers, right? I can't be forced to work more than 12, 16 hours a day. I can't be forced to, you can't just get rid of me at a moment's notice. You can't pay me nothing. You can't
exactly.
You can't do these things.
So the power dynamic, that's for all of his, for all the problematic issues with Heidegger and his politics, the power, and some of the things that he would say, you'd say, well, and you were supporting this,
yeah,
with Nazism and so on. But the power dynamic overarches, but is often buried so as we aren't supposed to think about that. And the revealing of it's rather a matrix-like thing. Okay, when you suddenly see what the reality really is, and the illusion that has been purveyed. Well, being in nothingness doesn't talk about the matrix, but when he writes about some of these kinds of things, I think he's saying there's a lot more power issues than we care to think about, and we must think about them. I mean, from a historiography or graphical point of view, I think it's interesting because he talks about how language controls us. He's one of the, so from a philosophical viewpoint, there have been many people in our at the end of the previous century, and certainly now, who are talking about how language is kind of the entity that manipulates as much as we cede power to language.
Yeah.
And so the language, we just automatically start assuming terms from other people. We start taking, and suddenly the culture shifts. We've seen this happen in front of our in our very lives over recent history. The way people will use language, how people will talk to each other, has changed dramatically. And some argue that, well, so all the ugliness has been revealed now, and nobody's backing away from it. Okay, that's a historical moment. Did it happen on X date? No, but I think that's what Heidegger's talking about. So history is not. In some ways, I think that what he writes of or suggests is that history is this kind of entity, thus historicism, because we give it the power to be that.
Yeah. And again, usually the best way to help people think about these things is examples, right? And a good one is I saw an article the other day that talks about things that millennials say that Gen Z people drives them nuts, right?
Yes.
And so you start reading through the list, and all of a sudden you start thinking, oh, wow, like that is something that just sort of popped up in modern, colloquialism, like adulting, right?
Right.
Gen Z people are like, millennials are always talking about adulting, as if doing regular everyday tasks was something that was completely different.
And what are we categorizing in the first place? What are we, millennials? Baby boomers, such a wide category is not to be a category at all. You're going to categorize a group of people across 25 years.
That's a type of historicism, isn't it? Because the government only recognizes the baby boomers as the only generation. That's the only one that they identify. And probably the reason for that is because there's a tangible jump in birth rate. So there's a tangible increase and decrease in birth rate that created a certain blip of people.
Right.
Everything else is essentially manufactured.
Yeah, millennial. So that means you were born around the turn of a century. And all of but it's this cluster of ugliness that is ascribed to millennials. And I think many of us have been guilty about that and ought to recant and rethink. Okay, because you were born around this time period, you're going to have this set of attitudes, and therefore I know you. That's as much as to say, because of your race, your ethnicity, your religion. Well, of course, this is how you all are. I've got you there. You're in my pocket, and we're done. It's a terrible thing.
I receive emails at work about this all the time. There'll be companies that are, hey, read this paper about how to manage different generations of people, and like what sort of management approach you should take and that sort of thing. And I've said it for a while that I think ageism is really like the biggest bastion of bias that still exists. Not to say that there aren't other ones, that they aren't important and big and stuff, but I think that ageism is probably the one that it gets no attention and it has a huge impact on people. And it goes both ways, right? You hear managers all the time, well, kids these days don't know how to work,
right.
Or you hear people, well, this guy's too old to do this job,
Right.
Well, what you're just basing these things, it's completely based on age rather than an individual assessment of somebody's talent or ability.
Yep, and now you've led us back to the two different approaches to history. One is the large sociological or economic or political mass, and the other is the individual. And they don't always coincide.
No, and there's definitely, there's preferential treatment given to the former because it's easier to have a historical record of it. But it doesn't really, within that, right? You can't just throw away the impact of the individual within it, right? Like we were talking about with Pompeii. You have records for, like I said, big events, big people throughout history. You can't see into the minutia of everyday life in a lot of cases, but it doesn't mean that it didn't have a huge impact on those big events and those big people of that time. So yeah, it's it's a wild topic. How do you think our views on historicity are affecting our current reality?
Well, I think this is a universal. We default sometimes to the notion of absolute truth. And therefore, if I have the absolute truth, you must not. Mm-hmm. And this allows us to dehumanize, make enemies of, reduce to categorical simplicities. And I think that idea of historicity is being warped by the lack of, again, attention to an appreciation of authority. And so my truth, your truth, their truth, there's nothing wrong with that. The truth of my experience may not be the truth of your experience. And there's every reason to reveal that, to talk about, well, why did those experiences happen? What has led to those experiences? That can lead you toward maybe understanding a little bit more about how we ought to approach people. But when you say this is completely wrong and you default to conspiracy theories, and you're much more willing to think that lizard people from some other place have invaded you, put nanites in your bloodstream in order to monitor you, and how does the voice of, look, this is the thing that we have here, this is the text, this is what was said, this is documentably what was done, that it's very hard to break through. When people like to gloss and say, no, that's not the way it happened. I know what's your source of knowledge is always the first thing I like to ask people.
Right.
Where'd you get that? Doesn't matter. Right? Where'd you get it? Well, we all know. No. Where did you get that? What is the provenance of that? And if it's because you just heard somebody say it, well, that doesn't mean that it's wrong of decided, but somebody said it. Well, why did they say it? Where did that come from? That's what history does. History is a constant regressive process of trying to figure out where things emerged. What emerged? How did it become what it is? And then why is it becoming what it is again? How is it being changed?
Yeah, it's funny because humans are we're storytelling creatures, right?
Yes.
Like it really doesn't take much at all to weave a whole narrative and to get off base from what the facts are, what actually happened or what actually transpired.
I think it's really telling that in our storytelling that in that sense, I think you know that there's something very important when people are so afraid to face it, to consider it, to look at it, because the power of that thing to change what has just been accepted as normal is immense. And so, of course, people are going to invent stories, anything but truer, anything but coming to terms with what actually happened. That's what history has power.
Yeah, and that's what I've been down a rabbit hole for a long time with esotericism, right?
Yeah.
Which is this sort of idea that there was
the esoterics are amazing,
right? You had religious events that happened, and then over time, over centuries, these people started to look at it and say, no, like something here isn't adding up. So we're going to say that there was a deeper meaning. There's a hidden meaning. There's a secret meaning. And they start to develop these rituals and these texts and things. And I mean, there is something to say that influences the course of history, right? Because you have Aleister Crowley, right? And you have these people who had a big impact on the world who had these beliefs. So if historicity can directly affect a course of events, is this a type of determinism? Do you think historicism has some sort of real weight?
I think historicism, again, from a layperson's view, I think that historicism has weight, but it's a chicken and egg thing. Do I think that there's some force of history that makes us to do things? Well, that would be to say that I think that there is a tangible and unchangeable human nature. And philosophy has debated science debates this whole concept of human nature. It has for 200 years or more. I don't think that there's such an absolute human nature that humans can't change. If they do, then that change must come from within. And that's the pain of slow change. And I think it's entirely possible that humanity as we know it will disappear. It's not unlikely. All kinds of life on this planet has had its time and disappeared. And, I don't say that glibly. I certainly would wish it's not the case. But when a historicism gets bent into the position of being the ultimate determining power, well, we just have to do this because this is just the way we are. Well, I just have to drive at 75 miles an hour all the time because it's just the way I am. And I really have to have a television screen right on my dashboard so I can watch it while I'm driving 75 miles an hour. So whatever happens is going to happen. It's out of my hands. That's a whacked historicism, I think.
Yeah. Do you think that raises like sort of a follow-up question for me? Do you think that a psychological behaviorist would, by extension, necessarily believe in historicism?
I think a psychological behaviorist would say there's a very adequate explanation for why we feel like we have to tag certain periods or extol or vilify certain moments. That there's a psychological basis for that. But that also means that we are able to take on our own psychology and say, well, why are we really doing this? Can we alter this to some extent? Whereas a determinist would say, nope, the forces of history will be the forces of history themselves.
Yeah, this has been fun. There's this underlying narrative that's sort of coming from it, which comes back to that idea of how we're perceiving what's happened before. I'd like to explore that more in some future episodes, as well as some of those other aspects, myth and legend and folklore and stuff.
This is always fun.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to look at in the future. Until next time, keep pondering.